Welcome to our year-end briefing. We have closed the books, and it's no surprise that Indiana collected significantly more revenue than we anticipated, and as a result, ended our fiscal year June 30, 2022, with approximately $3.9 billion, which when combined with our previous reserve balance equates to Indiana having more than $6.1 billion heading into next year. Indiana's historic $6.1 billion reserve balance gives legislators the flexibility to look at the statewide funding model as well as provide Indiana residents with assurances that Indiana can continue to provide essential services as our country faces an uncertain economic future. I want to thank my finance team, along with the teams of Office Management and Budget and State Budget Agency, for their dedication in providing Hoosiers with accurate and timely information. I want to turn it over to Chris and Zach to go into more detail about our financial data, including our revenue growth and statutory transfers. We will all be available to answer questions when their presentation is over. Thank you.
Thank you, Auditor Klutz. And my name's Chris Johnston. I'm the Director of the Office of Management and Budget, and it's a pleasure to be here this morning. I also want to thank Auditor Klutz and the entire Auditor Estate team for the tremendous amount of work that goes into closing the books each year. And I also want to thank my colleague, Zach Jackson, the Budget Director, and that team. It truly is a team effort between both the Budget Agency and the Auditor Estate's office in closing these books. It seems to get more complicated every year. I, too, am very pleased to report that Indiana's fiscal strength has been sustained through fiscal year 22 as we come out of the pandemic. June revenues continued the trend of the previous months, exceeding forecasts by $166 million, or 7%. All the categories, except one, exceeded the estimates. This resulted in total general fund revenues exceeding December's forecast by $1.2 billion for the fiscal year. Compared to the December forecast, both income taxes, individual and corporate, exceeded their forecast by almost 14%. This was the driving factor behind the total exceeding forecast by 6%. When we compare revenues to the prior year, revenues are up 9%. But as a reminder, I'd like to take a step back to fiscal year 20 and 21. You'll recall that we had deferred, due to the pandemic, the collection of individual and corporate income taxes from April of 2020 to July of 2020. So that's pushing those revenues about $900 million into the next fiscal year. And so if we sort of normalize, if we take those $900 million of revenue out of the base of 2021 and compare it to 2022's performance, we actually exceeded last year by over 14%, a very strong number. So what does this mean to our current fiscal status? As we often do, we publish what is called a surplus statement, of which I'm going to ask Zach to walk through certain points here. But the last time we really published it was in the December 2021 forecast. And at that time, the forecast was already predicting a $5.1 billion a reserve balance. So when you think about it, this $1.2 billion revenue increase added to the $5 billion that were already expected, that entire amount, that overperformance, drops right to the bottom line and puts us in a very sound position at that $6 billion. That forecast will be updated this December, and as you'll see here in a couple of minutes, it'll still be we're still expecting a very promising reserve balance at the end of fiscal year 23. Right now, I'll ask Zach to cover a few points that have occurred in the last fiscal year.
All right. Thank you, Chris, and thank you, Auditor Klutz. And let me start by just recognizing and thanking the senior executive team at the State Budget Agency, specifically Deputy Director Joe Habig, Deputy Director Lisa Ackelbert, Director of Financial Management Steve Daniels. I think the media all has a copy of our surplus statement, and it's also available online at the Budget Agency's website. But just a few things I want to point out. First of all, one thing that might look a little odd on our surplus statement are the revenues that we're showing for this new fiscal year that just started, FY23. We are still bound by the last revenue forecast, which was put together in December of 2021. And so that's why those numbers look a little odd in comparison to the fiscal year 22 actual revenues. This December, as part of budget development, the State Budget Committee will have a new forecast from the Revenue Technical Forecasting Committee, and those numbers will be updated for FY23 at that time. Kind of in the middle of that surplus statement, something that really stands out, and Auditor Klutz alluded to it earlier, normally when we close out a fiscal year, we're looking at a structural surplus, and by structural surplus, simply how much we brought in that year compared to how much we spent that year. We're usually in the ballpark of a few $100 million. And this year, large part due to our overperformance of revenues, we're closing the year with a structural surplus of approximately $3.9 billion. Looking at the very bottom line of the surplus statement, you can see that we're closing this year with $6.1 billion in the general fund combined balances. And again, just as a point of comparison, for the longest time, we've been in this position of having about $2 billion in the general fund, usually give or take about $200 million. But again, we were at 6.1 when we closed the books. A few other just one-time things to point out on the surplus statement. When we closed the books last fiscal year, at the end of FY21, the statutory excess reserve calculation resulted in a $545 million transfer to teachers' pensions, as well as a $545 million transfer for the automatic taxpayer refund. While that calculation occurred as part of closeout for last fiscal year, the transfer actually occurred within fiscal 22. Similarly, there is another excess reserve calculation that was triggered as part of closeout this year. This time, a one-time $2.5 billion transfer to teachers' pensions. It was calculated with FY22 closeout, but it will actually occur in fiscal 23, likely in August after that transfer and calculation is reviewed by the State Budget Committee. In addition to the surplus statement, we also put out the combined balance statement, and I'd like to spend just a moment on there. The numbers are, for the most part, all the same. The totals are all the same as the surplus statement, but this statement does a good job in explaining what I like to think about as the general fund checking account, as well as the three savings accounts that make up the general fund combined balances. In the general fund itself, the checking account, we closed the books with just a little over $4.5 billion in that checking account. The other savings accounts, if you will, consist of the Medicaid Contingency and Reserve, the State Tuition Reserve, as well as the Rainy Day Fund. For the Medicaid Contingency Reserve, we closed that with $429 million, and we anticipate that increasing this year as other reversions of unspent Medicaid dollars occur. The State Tuition Reserve Fund grew to $644 million this year, and that is the result of some underspending of the formulaic distribution to schools. And then the Rainy Day Fund, for the most part, stayed flat this year, but because of income growth during fiscal 22, it does trigger a transfer that will likely occur this month as part of fiscal 23 of approximately $450 million out of the general fund and into the Rainy Day Fund. And so again, those total $6.1 billion for this fiscal year that just ended, FY22, and right now we're on track with current revenue projections, current spending assumptions to end fiscal 23 with $5.1 billion in the general fund. And with that said, I'll turn it back over to Chris.
As Zach mentioned, based on the December forecast, It's anticipated that the reserve balance would end with over $5 billion at the end of fiscal year '23. That's 25% or more of the current year expenditures. It will likely result in an automatic taxpayer refund at this time next year. That is why the governor's very comfortable with proposing the accelerating a $1 billion automatic taxpayer refund for the General Assembly to consider in this special session. With that, we'll stop and answer any questions you might have. So from the governor's office, there's not any thought about increasing spending. As far as what the governor's proposed, I think he looked at the $1 billion as a reasonable amount of money based on where we exceeded the forecast at $1.2 billion this year, and is comfortable with that. And as Auditor Klutz mentioned, there's a lot of some developing uncertainty out there in the economy, and so I think this is one that's a prudent level, and we'd still be able to work towards putting a very sound budget plan together next year.
Did any of these numbers factor into any discussions about whether to suspend the gas tax versus doing the taxpayer refund? The Democrats have been pushing that one since March.
Well, actually, this actually results in a greater dollar amount going to the taxpayers as far as the refund goes. We looked at, we did similar calculations. That the gas tax really was never on the plate for the governor. It would be a holiday, if you will, for a specified number of months. At some point, you have to reinstate that. The money's being used for not only state but local and county roads, and so there would have to be sort of a make-whole provision from that perspective as well. So this is a system that if we use the ATR mechanism is probably the most efficient and effective means to get money back to the taxpayers' pocketbooks.
Chris, you just referenced Auditor Klutz talking about uncertainty in the economy. You look at the sales tax revenue numbers, and they actually came in just slightly below forecast. Is that a sign of concern for the Hoosier economy?
Well, as I've said before, I'm always concerned. I'm always the worrier here when it comes to these numbers. So it is something to watch. But I'll say this: that if you look at the information that we handed out, sales tax still exceeded last year by 10%, and that's without any shifting at all. So it's still very strong. I'll say this: that sales tax is probably one of those categories that's difficult to forecast. You have different goods and services. Some are taxed and some aren't taxed. Again, missed forecast by a little bit, but not in a significant way right now. But it's one of those categories we'll be watching.
On the flip side of that, the forecast missed the income tax projection by a lot. This is in the right direction, but it's a big potential.
Right. Well, a couple of things, I think. The market was good, and so there's a lot of estimated taxes that were probably paid. And then in the withholding area, we may have all read about wage and salary increases. And so I think that's, I take some comfort in that now we've got a new level, if you will. We've stepped up to a new level of withholding tax. Now, as far as the market performance and whether people need to pay estimated taxes or capital gains taxes, those sorts of things, we'll have to see how that plays out. But on the other side of income taxes, on the corporate income tax, I think that's the one is the most difficult to predict, because you're really, it's not only the performance of businesses in our state, but it's also the thing that we don't know is how those CFOs in those companies may be using their taxes for future planning, their own tax planning. So that's one that's really probably the most difficult in the income tax area stay on top of.
Several Republican legislators have brought up concerns about inflation raising the cost so much of state projects and so forth. Is there, how does that factor into you calling this $1 billion refund prudent? And you're facing who knows what size of increases in capital projects and other expenses the government
Right.
and needing money for is the health public health plan, possibly raising state wages, you have a lot of big expenses coming up.
That's correct. Well, Tom, couple of things. As Zach mentioned, the revenue forecast for fiscal year '23, we're still using the December forecast. That's going to be updated. But if you look at the surplus statement, it actually shows that revenues are going down by 5.5%. And so I think that's a very conservative starting point that, again, compared to the current year, next year's forecast is below where we wound up this year. It also factors in the tax cuts that were adopted by the legislature this spring. And then going forward, if we still have that $4 billion balance, there are opportunities in developing the next budget to do some cost overrun planning, if you will, of putting additional reserves aside for capital projects, which we've done in the past, and and the governor would definitely propose doing that in the future. So I think we have the capacity to plan for those, even doing the $1 billion automatic taxpayer refund.
Chris, given these numbers, how do you justify not expanding, not by the dollar amount per person, but not expanding the inflation relief proposal to cover those people who don't file taxes, like folks who are on Social Security and disability?
Well, again, I'll say that the system we've got is the probably the most effective and efficient way to go about doing it and to move as quickly as possible. As far as adding additional people as eligible recipients, I would imagine that that's something that the legislature will consider in the special session. But we really have we don't know who those people are and how many that might be, and so it's something that we'd have to explore. It would change the whole dynamic, I think, on this a little bit, in the sense that here's a population that we can't define. We would have to take that $1 billion and probably do some sort of calculation to set aside that money for the people that aren't defined. And then if they don't show up, we'll still have money that we've left on the table and haven't gotten that back out to those citizens. And so it also develops a whole new, or requires a whole new application process, and then a process to verify the information on those applications. So there's going to be a lot of operational needs that would have to go along with that.
You brought up the $2.5 billion going over to the pre-96 teacher pension. More broadly, and I'm not sure if this is more a question for you or for Auditor Klutz, are there any other pension liabilities that you kind of really got your eye on that potentially lawmakers ought to consider getting some of this excess for?
The rest of the pension plans in the system are all very well funded, and in fact, we rank very well compared to other states, and have been very disciplined, not only on those plans, but I'll even say that the one that we're trying to address right now, the legislature has been very disciplined in that regard. They started developing a revised plan back in the 2000s with a commitment. We make $1 billion. Without these additional paydowns, we make $1 billion appropriation to this plan every year. And what this is doing is allowing us to cut short that commitment, I think maybe by a half, maybe 30 years, of which we're going to have to make these annual appropriations. So other plans, no, those are doing just fine. And this one, I think we're doing well as also.
The Democrats have said that thrown out an estimate of perhaps 1 million people that aren't getting the automatic taxpayer refund. Do you think that number is accurate, or
I think we just have to look at the data. If they may have, if you go out and you look at Indiana's population, and you sort it by age, I could see where they come up with that number. But there's other census data and other resources to use to come up with what that is. But I'm not saying that that's the right or incorrect number.
Similar to how previous closeouts have operated, was there any thought of trying to pay down a bond before closing out with $6 billion?
Well, we always look at that, but we've been so successful. The Indiana Finance Authority has paid down just about all the bonds where it makes economic sense to do so. And so I don't think that there's anything on the table right now. I think we've retired a lot of the construction debt at state parks and state hospitals, and so there's not much left. And again, it has to make economic sense to do so.
One criticism's been with the automatic taxpayer refunds just been the time it's taken to get those sent out. I know Department of Revenue is still sending out the automatic refunds. I don't know if the auditor's office even started sending out paper checks yet. Just sort of update on that. And then also, how quickly do you think the second round, if it's approved, is that going to go out any faster? What sort of timeline would you all project on that?
Okay. I'll defer to the auditor on some of those operations, but I will say this, that the Department of Revenue obviously was able to act very expeditiously on the electronic transfers, and those are 99% done. But we still obviously have to produce the checks for the other taxpayers.
Yeah, thank you for the question. My office is contracting with a vendor to issue those checks because they are double the amount of checks I normally issue in a year, and we're trying to get those out quickly. Earlier last week, we were notified by our vendor that there's a paper supply issue on the supply chain, and we plan on getting those in early August at this point, and we're ready to start printing as soon as we get the paper check supply.
How many checks are we talking about having to go out?
Approximately 1.7 million.
How long do you think that will take for
Our-
the supply issue?
Well, they're currently anticipating we get the shipment in early August. It will take them 3 days to set up. We're planning on printing 50,000 checks per day, and our current estimate is 35 days from the day we start printing. Thank you.
Do you think that would be any quicker if the second round was approved, you have to go through that same process again?
It'll just depend on the timing of everything. I think our plan is to get the paper, queue up the printing, and hopefully we can start getting the remainder, the other half of that money out to taxpayers. But we all know special session is starting July 25th, so I guess that's going to go on the side while we're waiting on the paper.
Is that contract with the vendor an additional cost, or was that already accounted for?
An additional cost for the issuing of these checks, it was a special contract. We normally issue all of our checks in-house. We print between 600,000 and 800,000 checks a year, and so with this 1.7 million checks, it was something that needed to be contracted out.
Eric, that follows that 1.7 million paper checks, that's just this month, or that's how many will be sent out?
That's the total number of people that we have in the queue to receive the first automatic taxpayer refund of $125 per person or couple that are on the Department of Revenue's list under the new legislation that passed earlier this year.
So that's all, that's electronic and paper?
No. So we've already issued 99% of the direct deposits, which is approximately $250 million. So there's still money left over, and that is saved for the 1.7 million paper checks that we are contracted to print as soon as we get the paper.
And none of those have gone out, that's where we're saying August, those should start going out.
Yes, the vendor has informed us that our current delivery is early August. It will take them a few days to gear up, and we're set to print 50,000 checks a day per workday when we get started.
And just the other going back to what Tom was asking, since the plan for the second rebate has been to roll it into the first negotiation, not the
At this point, we've got proposals on the table, and we're just, we really can't do anything with that. I mean, the legislators make the law, and we have to implement it. And so I know there's discussion about it. The timing is interesting, but we're waiting on the paper.
Do you think the process will go faster for the automatic refund for the direct deposits if this second round is approved by the legislature?
The direct deposits are very simple, regardless of the timing. Department of Revenue has a file with that information, and it's basically, there's probably a little setup as well with the bank that provides those electronic transfers, but that one is very easy. Again, I think what Tom, you and Eric are asking, and what the auditors mentioned is, in this, I'll use an often used phrase, timing is everything right now, is if there's an opportunity to prepare the files for the paper checks, and it's just changing the dollar amount because something has been adopted timely and we're able to include that, we can take care of it in one fell swoop.
But not necessarily. It sounds like if paper arrives at the legislature, it's still trying to get this to the governor's desk, there could be two checks instead of one.
There could be, but we're going to try to make the best decision possible with the least cost. Okay. Thank you very much.